The evening air hung thick and still over Washington, D.C., the kind of late summer heat that clings to your skin even after the sun dips below the rooftops. Inside her unassuming silver sedan, the woman at the wheel let out a slow, deep breath, her shoulders finally dropping an inch after hours of tension. She'd just wrapped up a marathon session at the National Security Operations Center, a high-stakes briefing on emerging threats overseas that had stretched far past dinner time. Her eyes felt gritty, her mind buzzing with classified details and contingency plans, but her body craved nothing more than the quiet of her own living room, a glass of iced tea, and maybe 10 minutes of silence before sleep. She wasn't driving a luxury car. No tinted windows, no government plates. Just a reliable 5-year-old sedan she'd bought herself long before anyone imagined she'd hold one of the most powerful positions in the country. She wore simple clothes, dark jeans, a soft cotton blouse, and flat shoes. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and sunglasses still covered her eyes even though the streetlights had flickered on. She looked like any other professional heading home after a long day, because in that moment that's exactly what she wanted to be. Not the director of national security, not the first black woman to ever sit in that chair, just a tired person trying to get home. She turned onto a quiet residential street in a leafy northwest neighborhood, tree-lined with well-kept houses and the occasional porch light glowing warmly. It was a shortcut she sometimes took to avoid the heavier traffic near Rock Creek Park. The radio was off. She preferred the quiet hum of the engine, the soft thump of tires on pavement. Her thoughts drifted, not to missile trajectories or diplomatic cables, but to the book waiting on her nightstand, the one she hadn't opened in weeks. Then, without warning, red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Her stomach tightened instantly. Not fear, she'd faced far worse, but a weary kind of resignation. She signaled smoothly, pulled over to the curb, and came to a gentle stop beneath the shade of an old oak tree. She turned off the engine, rolled down her window, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. It was a habit drilled into her long before her current role, back when she was just a young woman learning how to navigate a world that often saw her as suspicious, simply for existing in certain spaces. A police cruiser parked behind her, its headlights casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The officer stepped out, a man in his early 30s, broad-shouldered with a stiff posture and a hand resting near his belt. He approached slowly, his expression unreadable under the brim of his cap. He didn't greet her, didn't say evening or ma'am. He just stood there for a beat, peering into the car like he was inspecting a suspect, not a citizen who'd pulled over without protest. "License and registration," he said, his voice flat. She nodded calmly. "Of course." She reached slowly for her glove compartment, moving deliberately so there'd be no sudden gestures. "My registration is in here. My license is in my wallet." She kept her voice even, neutral, no edge, no defiance, just cooperation. She'd learned early that any hint of irritation could be misread as aggression. She handed him both documents. He took them without a word, his eyes flicking between her face and the papers. A long silence stretched. Crickets chirped in the nearby yard. A dog barked 2 houses down. The street was otherwise still. "You know why I pulled you over?" he finally asked. "I signaled before I turned," she replied gently. "But if I missed it, I apologize. It was an honest mistake." He narrowed his eyes slightly. "You didn't signal," she didn't argue. Arguing never helped. Understood. He studied her license again, then looked back at her. "This your car?" "Yes. Where are you coming from?" "Work," she said simply. "What kind of work?" She hesitated, not because she was hiding anything, but because she knew how answers could be twisted. "I work for the federal government." He let out a short, skeptical breath. "Yes, doing what?" She kept her tone light, almost conversational. "I'm in national security." He actually chuckled, quietly but unmistakably. It wasn't friendly. It was the kind of laugh that said, "Sure you are." He glanced around, as if expecting someone else to appear and confirm his suspicion that she was lying. "National security," he repeated, like it was a punchline. "And you drive this?" She didn't flinch. "It gets me where I need to go." He shifted his weight, his hand drifting closer to his sidearm. "Step out of the vehicle." Her pulse quickened, but her face remained calm. "May I ask why?" "Officer safety," he said, as if that explained everything. "Just step out. Hands where I can see them." She took another slow breath. This was the moment where things could go sideways, fast. She'd seen it happen to others. She'd read the reports. She knew the statistics. A routine stop turning into something far worse because of a look, a tone, a misunderstood movement. She unbuckled her seatbelt with exaggerated slowness. "I'm going to open the door now," she said clearly. "I'll keep my hands visible at all times." She stepped out, standing straight but not rigid, arms relaxed at her sides but palms open. She made sure to stay near the car, not blocking his view, not making herself a larger target than necessary. She watched his eyes, how they darted to her hands, then to the car, then back to her face, searching for something he clearly expected to find. Guilt, fear, deception. "You seem nervous," he said. "I'm tired," she corrected gently. "Long day." He stepped closer. "You live around here?" "No, I was just taking a shortcut home." "Where's home?" She gave the name of her neighborhood. Respectable, not far, but not this one. He nodded slowly, as if filing that away as further evidence of something being off. "Mind if I check the trunk?" he asked. She didn't sigh, didn't roll her eyes. "Do you have probable cause?" He stiffened. "I'm conducting an investigation." "You pulled me over for a turn signal," she reminded him, still calm. "Unless you have reason to believe there's evidence of a crime in my trunk, I'd prefer not to consent to a search." That seemed to irritate him. His jaw tightened. "You're being uncooperative." "I'm being lawful," she said. "There's a difference." A car slowed as it passed, the driver glancing over with curiosity. Then another. Someone on the porch across the street stood up, phone in hand. She noticed but didn't react. Let them watch. Let them record. Truth had nothing to fear from light. The officer stepped back, hand now resting fully on his holster. "Stay right there," he said, walking back to his cruiser. She heard the crackle of his radio as he called in her license plate and name. She stood perfectly still, eyes forward, breathing steadily. She thought about the secure phone in her bag, encrypted, satellite-linked, capable of reaching the president in under 30 seconds. But she wouldn't use it. Not yet. This wasn't about pulling rank. It was about surviving a moment that shouldn't even be dangerous, but was, because of who she was and how she looked. Minutes passed. The night air grew cooler, but sweat gathered at the back of her neck. She heard the officer's voice again, sharper now, talking to someone on the radio. Then he returned, his expression darker. "Your ID checks out," he admitted, though it sounded like it pained him to say it. "But I still don't like your story." "My story?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "I told you where I work. That's verifiable." "Yeah, well, people lie," he said, "especially when they're trying to cover something up." She looked at him then, not with anger, but with a quiet sadness. "What do you think I'm covering up?" He didn't answer. Instead, he circled the car, peering into the windows, shining his flashlight into the back seat. He opened the passenger door without asking, rummaged through the glove compartment she'd already shown him. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched, her mind racing not with panic but with a deep, familiar frustration. How many times had this happened? Not to her personally in this exact way, but to people who looked like her, lived like her, worked just as hard. She'd spent her career protecting this country, making decisions that affected millions, and yet here she was, treated like a criminal for driving while black in a nice neighborhood. Finally, he closed the door with a thud. "You can go," he said curtly. She didn't thank him. Didn't say, "Have a nice night." She simply walked back to her car, got in, started the engine, and pulled away slowly, checking her mirrors to ensure she didn't give him any excuse to stop her again. Only when she was 2 blocks away did she allow herself to exhale fully. Her hands trembled slightly on the wheel. She drove the rest of the way home in silence, the encounter replaying in her mind. Not with rage, but with a heavy clarity. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about a system that taught people to see her as a threat before seeing her as a person. And as much as she wanted to collapse onto her couch and forget it ever happened, she knew she couldn't, because tomorrow, she'd walk into the most secure building in the nation, brief the president on global threats, and make decisions that shaped national policy, and no one would question her authority until she stepped outside that building and looked like someone who doesn't belong. She pulled into her driveway, turned off the car, and sat for a long moment in the dark. The house was quiet, safe. But the feeling of being watched, judged, doubted, it lingered. She reached into her bag not for the secure phone but for her personal one. She opened her notes app and typed 3 words. "We need change." Then she got out, locked the car, and walked inside, her steps steady, her resolve quiet but unshaken. The night wasn't over. Not really. Because somewhere out there, another person who looked like her was being pulled over, questioned, made to feel small. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that her job wasn't just about national security. It was also about making sure that security extended to people like her, on every street in every neighborhood, no matter what car they drove or what they were wearing. The officer didn't walk away. That was the first sign something had shifted. After telling her she could go, he'd taken 2 steps back toward his cruiser, then stopped, turned, watched her get in the car like he was waiting for her to do something wrong just by starting the engine. She kept her movement slow, deliberate, eyes straight ahead, hands at 10 and 2, but as she eased off the brake and began to pull away, his voice cut through the night again. "Hold on." Her foot hovered over the gas. She didn't sigh, didn't mutter under her breath. She just stopped, put the car in park, and waited. This time he didn't approach the window. He came around to the driver's side and rapped his knuckles sharply on the roof of the car. Once, twice, like he was summoning a disobedient dog. "Step out again," he said, his voice lower now, edged with something that wasn't quite authority but something close to it. Suspicion hardened into certainty. She looked up at him through the open window. "You just said I could leave. And now I'm asking you to step out," he replied, jaw tight. "Unless you'd rather I cuff you first." Her stomach dropped, but her face stayed calm. She knew that tone. It wasn't about procedure anymore. It was about control, about making her feel small. She nodded once, slowly, and opened the door. This time she didn't announce her movements. She just did them, smooth, unhurried, hands always visible. He stood back a little farther than before, like she might lunge at him. "Put your hands behind your back," she didn't argue. Didn't ask why. She just turned slightly and placed her palms together behind her. The cold metal of the cuffs clicked around her wrists before she could even process it. They weren't tight enough to hurt, but they were real, solid, final. "Why am I being handcuffed?" she asked, voice steady. "Because you're not cooperating," he said, though she hadn't raised her voice, hadn't refused a single lawful order. "And because I don't believe your story." "What part of it don't you believe?" she asked, turning to face him fully. "That I work for the government? That I drive this car? That I live in this city?" "All of it," he said flatly. "People like you don't just drive through here looking like that." She didn't flinch, but the words landed like a stone in her chest. "People like you." She'd heard it before, in boardrooms, in airports, in grocery stores. Always coded, never direct, but always clear. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this neighborhood. Not in this car. Not in this country's highest offices. And certainly not free. A neighbor had come out onto their porch now. A woman in a robe, holding a phone. Another person stood near the sidewalk, recording. The officer glanced at them, then back at her as if their presence annoyed him. He opened the back door of his cruiser. "Get in." She hesitated for only a second. "Am I under arrest?" "You're being detained for further investigation," he said, avoiding the question. "Now get in the car." She slid into the back seat. The vinyl was warm from the day's heat, and it smelled faintly of sweat and cleaning spray. The door clicked shut behind her, locking automatically. She sat upright, hands still cuffed behind her, eyes fixed on the street ahead. Her mind wasn't racing with panic, it was calculating. How long before someone notices she's missing? Her assistant knew she left the office at 8:15. She was due to check in by 9:30 for a secure overnight briefing. If she didn't respond, protocols would kick in. But that could take time. And time in situations like this was never on her side. Outside, the officer paced near his cruiser, talking into his radio. She caught fragments. Female, late 30s, driving a silver sedan. Claims to work in national security. Doesn't add up. He sounded frustrated, like the system wasn't giving him the confirmation he wanted. Because, of course, her official records weren't flagged in local police databases. Her identity was protected by layers of federal clearance, not public records. Then he walked back to the car and opened her door again. "Who exactly do you work for?" he demanded, leaning in. She met his eyes. I can't discuss classified details with unauthorized personnel. He scoffed. Oh, so now it's classified? That's convenient. It's not convenient, she said quietly. It's the law. He slammed the door shut harder than necessary. She heard him mutter something under his breath, words she didn't catch but didn't need to. She closed her eyes for a moment, not in defeat but to center herself. She thought about her mother, who'd taught her to always carry her ID, to speak politely to police, to never give them a reason, but also to never forget that sometimes just being herself was reason enough in their eyes. Minutes stretched. A patrol car pulled up behind the first one. 2 more officers got out, one older with salt and pepper hair, the other younger, wide-eyed. They spoke briefly with the first officer, glancing toward the back seat where she sat. The older one walked over and peered in. You okay in there? He asked, his tone less hostile. I'm fine, she said, but I'd like to know why I'm being detained. He glanced at his colleague, then back at her. He says you're being evasive. I've answered every question I legally can, she replied. I've shown ID, I've complied with every instruction. I haven't resisted. I haven't argued. What more do you want? The older officer didn't answer right away. He studied her face, the calmness, the lack of fear, the quiet dignity. It didn't fit the profile of someone hiding something. What's your actual job title? He asked, softer now. She hesitated, not because she was lying, but because saying it out loud felt absurd in this context. I'm the Director of National Security. The younger officer behind him let out a short laugh. The older one didn't. He just frowned like he was trying to decide if she was delusional or dangerous. Right, the first officer said, stepping up, and I'm the Secretary of Defense. Come on. But the older officer held up a hand. Let me run it through downtown, he said. Just to be sure. Waste of time, the first officer muttered, but he stepped back. The older officer returned to his car. She watched him pick up his radio, speak in low tones. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw his posture change. First skeptical, then confused, then alarmed. He turned sharply and looked back at her, his eyes wide. Within 2 minutes, he was back at her window. Ma'am, he said, voice suddenly respectful, I'm going to need you to step out again. She did, still cuffed. He unlocked the cuffs immediately, his movements quick, almost apologetic. I'm very sorry about this, he said, not meeting her eyes. There's been a misunderstanding. The first officer stood frozen a few feet away, his face pale under the streetlight. He'd overheard the radio call. He knew now. She rubbed her wrists gently, the skin slightly red but unbroken. She didn't say it's okay. She didn't say no harm done. She just looked at the older officer and said, I need to make a call. Of course, he said quickly. Use my radio or your phone, whatever you need. She reached into her pocket for her personal cell. But before she could dial, headlights swept across the street. A black SUV with dark windows and no visible markings pulled up smoothly behind the patrol cars. 2 people in dark suits stepped out. Calm, focused, moving with the quiet confidence of those used to operating in high-stakes environments. They didn't flash badges. They didn't shout. One simply walked up to the older officer and said, We're with the National Security Council. We've been trying to reach the director for the past 20 minutes. Is she all right? The officer nodded mutely, stepping aside. The agents turned to her. Ma'am, one said, relief clear in his voice. We were worried, she gave a small nod. I'm fine, just delayed. The first officer stood rooted to the spot, his earlier bravado completely gone. He looked like he wanted to disappear into the pavement. The older officer cleared his throat. Sir, he said to the agent, we're handling this internally. It was a mistake. The agent didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on her. Do you want to file a report, ma'am? She paused. She could. She had every right. But she thought about what that would mean, not just for her, but for the bigger picture. A formal complaint would make this personal. She wanted it to be systemic. She wanted people to understand this wasn't about one bad officer. It was about a pattern, a culture, a blindness that put lives at risk every single day. Not tonight, she said finally. But I'll be speaking with the department soon. The agents exchanged a glance. They understood. They'd seen it before, in different forms in different cities. They knew the weight she carried. She turned to the officers. I appreciate your assistance, she said, her voice calm, professional. Then she looked directly at the first officer, the one who'd cuffed her. who'd doubted her, who'd made her feel like an intruder in her own city. "I hope you learn from this," she said, not with anger but with quiet gravity. "Because next time it might not be me. It might be someone who doesn't have the same protections, and they might not walk away." He didn't respond. Couldn't. He just stood there, head slightly bowed, the reality of what he'd done crashing down on him. She got into the back of the SUV. The door closed softly. As they pulled away, she looked out the window at the quiet street, the porch lights, the trees, the cruiser still parked at the curb. It looked peaceful, normal, but she knew better. Beneath the surface of ordinary nights, ordinary streets, ordinary stops, there was a current of fear and assumption that ran deep. And it didn't just affect her. It affected teachers, doctors, students, mothers, anyone who didn't fit someone else's narrow idea of who belonged. The agent in the front seat glanced back. "Do you want us to take you home, ma'am?" "Yes," she said. "And then I need a secure line to the Attorney General's office." He nodded. No questions, just action. As the city lights blurred past, she leaned back and closed her eyes. She wasn't angry. Not really. She was tired, bone-deep tired, but also resolved. This wouldn't be the end of the story. It would be the beginning of something else. Something necessary. Because if someone in her position, someone with her title, her access, her voice could be treated this way, then how many others were being treated worse with no one to speak for them? She opened her eyes and looked out at the passing streets, no longer just roads home, but reminders. Reminders that security wasn't just about borders and bombs. It was about dignity. About being seen, about being believed, and she intended to make sure that kind of security reached everyone, not just the ones in power, but the ones who'd never even been given a chance to be seen as belonging. The black SUV moved smoothly through the quiet DC streets, its tinted windows shielding the inside from curious eyes. Inside, the air was cool, quiet, and calm, almost too calm, like the world outside had been paused. She sat in the back seat, hands resting in her lap, staring out at the passing streetlights without really seeing them. Her mind wasn't on the buildings or the traffic. It was still back on that curb under that oak tree, with the weight of cold metal around her wrists and the sound of disbelief in an officer's voice when she told him who she was. One of the agents in the front seat glanced back through the rearview mirror. "Ma'am," he said gently, "we can have a medical team meet you at home if you'd like, or we can take you straight to the secure wing at headquarters." She shook her head slightly. "No, I'm fine, just take me home." He nodded and didn't press. They'd been trained to read people, to sense when silence was needed more than words. And right now she needed space, not to fall apart but to gather herself. Because what happened wasn't just personal, it was a crack in the system she was supposed to protect. And cracks like that could let in more than just doubt. They could let in danger. As they turned onto her street, her phone buzzed softly in her pocket. Not her secure line, the personal one. A text from her assistant. "Everything okay?" "You missed the 9:30 check-in." She typed back quickly, delayed. "Home soon, we'll brief you in the morning." She didn't explain, not yet. Because once she did, the story would leave her hands. It would become news. It would become politics. And she wanted to control how it was told. Not for her sake, but for the sake of everyone who'd lived some version of this night and never had a voice loud enough to be heard. The SUV pulled into her driveway. The agents waited as she stepped out, scanning the street, the trees, the shadows. Old habits from a life spent in high-risk roles. But tonight, the real threat hadn't come from a foreign agent or a cyber attack. It had come from someone sworn to protect her. She walked inside, locked the door behind her, and stood in the quiet of her entryway for a long moment. The house smelled like lavender and old books, safe, familiar. She kicked off her shoes, poured a glass of water, and sat at the kitchen table. No tea, no book, just stillness. Then she picked up her secure phone. She didn't call the president, not yet. She called the deputy attorney general, a woman she'd worked with for years, someone who understood both national security and civil rights. The line connected on the second ring. "It's me," she said. A pause. Then, "Are you all right? We got an alert from your team." "I'm physically fine," she said. "But I was just detained by local police, handcuffed, questioned like a suspect. All because I didn't look like I belonged in a certain neighborhood." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Where? When?" She gave the details. Time, location, officer's description. He didn't recognize me, didn't believe my ID, assumed I was lying about my job. Even after I told him what I did, he laughed. Another silence. Longer this time. Do you want us to open an investigation? I want more than that, she said, her voice low but firm. I want this to mean something. Not just for me, for everyone who's been treated like a criminal for driving while black, walking while black, just existing, while black in a space someone decided they shouldn't be in. I hear you, the deputy AG said. We'll move carefully, but we'll move. They talked for another 10 minutes, about protocols, about data, about how many similar complaints had come through federal channels in the past year. The numbers were higher than most people realized, and most never made it past local departments. After she hung up, she sat there for a while longer, staring at the wall. She thought about calling her mother, but she didn't. Her mother had lived through worse. She'd raised her daughter to be strong, to be smart, to rise, but also to know that no amount of success would ever fully shield her from the world's assumptions. That lesson had been painful but true, and tonight it had been proven again. She finally stood, walked to her bedroom, and changed into soft pajamas. She brushed her teeth, washed her face, tried to let the tension drain from her shoulders. But sleep wouldn't come, so she sat by the window watching the moonlight spill across the yard and made a decision. She wouldn't hide this. She wouldn't let it be swept under the rug as an isolated incident, because it wasn't isolated. It was part of a pattern, and patterns could be changed. The next morning, she arrived at the National Security Complex earlier than usual. The building was already humming with activity. Analysts sipping coffee, guards checking badges, screens flashing with global data streams. No one looked at her differently. No one whispered. To them, she was exactly who she was supposed to be, the director. In charge, trusted, respected, but she knew that outside these walls the story was already spreading. By mid-morning, a short clip had surfaced online, grainy, shot from a phone across the street. It showed her stepping out of her car, hands raised, then being cuffed. The audio was muffled, but you could hear the officer say, "People like you don't just drive through here." The video had no context, no names, but it didn't need any. People recognized her, or at least enough people did. Her communications team came to her office, concerned. "Ma'am, this is going viral. News outlets are calling. Some are asking for a statement." She leaned back in her chair. "Let them call." "But the optics are the point," she interrupted gently. "This isn't about damage control. It's about truth." She spent the next hour drafting a short, clear statement, not defensive, not angry, just factual. She confirmed the incident. She confirmed her identity. She thanked the officers who later intervened. And then she added one line that would echo far beyond the press release. "If this can happen to me, with all the protections my position affords, imagine what happens to those who have none." She sent it to her team. "Release it at noon." At 11:45, her phone rang. It was the police chief of the district where the stop occurred. His voice was tight with urgency. "Ma'am, I just saw the statement draft. I want you to know we take this extremely seriously. Officer Reeves has been placed on administrative leave pending a full internal review. We're also initiating mandatory bias training for all patrol units." She listened quietly. "That's a start," she said. "But training alone won't fix a culture that teaches officers to see certain people as threats before they see them as human beings." "I understand," he said. "And I'd like to meet with you, face to face, to discuss how we can do better." She considered it. She could refuse. She could demand accountability from a distance. But real change didn't happen through punishment alone. It happened through conversation, through shared understanding, through people in power choosing to listen. "Send me a time," she said. "I'll be there." At noon, the statement went live. Within an hour, every major news network was running the story. Headlines varied. Some focused on the injustice, others on the irony. A few even tried to spin it as officer just doing his job. But the public reaction was overwhelming. People shared their own stories. Teachers, lawyers, doctors, veterans, all saying, "This happened to me too." By early afternoon, the White House issued its own statement. The president stands firmly behind the director and supports a full review of policing practices that disproportionately impact communities of color. She didn't watch the coverage. She had a secure briefing on cyber threats from a hostile nation. Life didn't stop because she'd been humiliated. The world kept turning. Missiles still flew. Hackers still probed. And she still had a job to do. But during a break, her assistant handed her a printed email. It was from a high school student in Atlanta. "I saw what happened to you," it read. "I want to work in national security one day. Does this mean I'll never really belong?" Her throat tightened. She wrote back personally, "You belong more than you know, and I'll make sure the door stays open for you." That afternoon, 2 men in suits arrived at the police precinct where Officer Reeves worked. They weren't journalists. They were federal investigators from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. They requested all body cam footage, radio logs, and personnel records related to the stop. The department complied without hesitation. Later that evening, Officer Reeves sat alone in his living room. His wife had taken the kids to her sister's. The TV was off. His phone kept buzzing. News alerts, messages from fellow officers, a few angry voicemails from strangers. He replayed the stop in his head over and over. He remembered her calm voice, her steady eyes, the way she never raised her voice even when he cuffed her, and then the moment his sergeant whispered in his ear, "That's the Director of National Security. Dan, you just arrested the person who oversees the entire U.S. intelligence apparatus." He hadn't slept since. He picked up his department-issued training manual, the one on de-escalation and implicit bias. He'd skimmed it during orientation, checked the box, moved on. Now he opened it for the first time. Page after page talked about assumptions, about snap judgments, about how fear could cloud judgment even in trained professionals. He closed the book and stared at his badge on the coffee table. For the first time, he wondered if he'd earned it. Back at her office, she reviewed the preliminary findings from the internal police report. The stop had no legal basis, no probable cause, no reasonable suspicion beyond she looked out of place. The officer had violated at least 3 department policies. But she knew firing him wouldn't solve the root problem. The system had shaped him, and the system needed to change. She called a meeting with the heads of the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Attorney General's office. Not to assign blame, but to build something new. "We need a task force," she said, "not just to investigate this incident, but to examine how federal funding is tied to local policing practices. If a department receives federal grants for counterterrorism or emergency response, they should meet baseline standards for equitable policing." There was silence around the table. Some nodded slowly. Others looked uneasy. This wasn't their usual terrain. "It's not just about fairness," she continued. "It's about national security. When communities don't trust law enforcement, they don't report threats. They don't cooperate. That creates blind spots, real dangerous blind spots. What happened to me last night isn't just a civil rights issue. It's a security vulnerability. That got their attention." By the end of the meeting, they'd agreed to draft a proposal within the week. She walked back to her office, tired but focused. Outside her window, the sun was setting over the city, the same city where, just 24 hours earlier, she'd been treated like a stranger in her own home. But she wasn't broken. She wasn't silenced. She was building something better, not for herself, for the next person who just wanted to drive home after a long day without fear. The story didn't fade. That was the first thing she noticed. Usually news cycles moved fast. Scandal today, crisis tomorrow, forgotten by next week. But this one stuck. Maybe because it was so simple. A woman pulled over for no real reason. Handcuffed, disbelieved, and then the twist, she turned out to be one of the most powerful people in the country. It wasn't just shocking, it was revealing. Like someone had lifted a curtain and shown everyone what had been happening in plain sight all along. Within days, the body cam footage was released not by her, but by the police department, under pressure from the Justice Department. It showed everything. Her calm compliance, the officer's growing suspicion, the moment he laughed at her job title, the unnecessary cuffs. The audio was clear. No distortion. No editing. Just truth, raw and uncomfortable. People watched it in classrooms, in living rooms, in police academies. Some were angry. Some were ashamed. Some were just sad because they'd lived it or loved someone who had. She didn't give interviews. Not at first. She let the facts speak. But when the Senate Judiciary Committee invited her to testify, she didn't hesitate. Not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a public servant with a duty to speak on something that affected national safety. The morning of the hearing, she wore a simple navy suit, no flashy pins, no dramatic gestures. She walked into the chamber with her usual quiet confidence, but there was something different in her eyes. A weight, yes, but also a resolve that hadn't been there before. She took her seat at the long wooden table, microphones adjusted, cameras clicking. Senators filed in, some nodding respectfully, others avoiding her gaze. She didn't take it personally. She knew this wasn't about her. It was about what her experience represented. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't read from a script. She spoke slowly, clearly, like she was explaining something important to a friend. "Last week," she began, "I was driving home after a 16-hour day coordinating a response to a potential cyber attack on our power grid. I was tired. I was thinking about my laundry, my unread mail, the book on my nightstand. I wasn't thinking about race. I wasn't thinking about power. I was just going home." She paused. The room was silent. Then I saw the lights. I pulled over. I did everything I was taught to do, hands visible, calm voice, no sudden moves. And still I was treated like a threat. Not because of what I did, but because of how I looked. She looked around the room, meeting eyes where she could. I say this not to ask for sympathy. I say it because I have a platform and I have a responsibility. If this could happen to me, with Secret Service detail, with encrypted phones, with direct access to the president, then what happens to the nurse driving home from a night shift? The college student visiting a friend in a nice neighborhood? The grandfather walking his dog? She leaned forward slightly. This isn't just about one officer. It's about a system that trains people to see danger in dark skin before they see humanity. And that system doesn't just hurt individuals, it weakens our entire country. Then she shifted tone, calmer, more strategic. From a national security perspective, distrust between communities and law enforcement is a critical vulnerability. When people don't trust the police, they don't report suspicious activity. They don't come forward as witnesses. They don't cooperate with investigations. That creates blind spots, real dangerous gaps where threats can grow unseen. She cited examples: a foiled bombing plot in Boston that relied on a tip from a local resident, a human trafficking ring broken up because a neighbor spoke up. Those successes only happen when communities feel safe engaging with law enforcement. Right now, too many don't. She ended not with blame, but with a call to action. We can fix this. Not by shaming individuals, but by changing systems. Mandate de-escalation training. Audit traffic stop data for racial disparities. Tie federal funding to verified reforms. And most importantly, listen to the people who've been telling us this was happening for decades. When she finished, there was no applause. Senate rules, but several senators nodded slowly. One wiped his eyes. Another scribbled furious notes. After the hearing, she walked out into the hallway where a small group of reporters waited. They shouted questions. Will you press charges? Do you forgive the officer? What's next? She stopped, turned, and faced them. I'm not here for revenge, she said. I'm here for repair. And repair takes time, honesty, and shared effort. Then she got into the waiting car and left. Back at her office, things had changed. Not in the building itself. The secure doors still beeped. The analysts still tracked global threats, but in the air. People looked at her differently. Not with pity, but with a new kind of respect. They saw her not just as a leader, but as someone who'd walked through fire and come out speaking truth. Her inbox was flooded, not just with official memos, but with messages from strangers. A retired teacher in Detroit wrote, I was pulled over 3 times last year for driving while black. Thank you for saying what so many of us can't. A young man in Chicago. I want to be a cop, but after seeing this, I'm scared I'll become like him. How do I stay good? She answered as many as she could. Short notes, encouragement, resources. Meanwhile, the officer who stopped her, Reeves, was still on leave. He hadn't spoken to the press, hadn't posted online, but quietly, he'd enrolled in a community-based anti-bias program run by a local civil rights group. He sat in circles with people who'd been profiled, listening, really listening as they shared their stories. At first, he kept his head down, But by the third session, he raised his hand and said, "I didn't think I was racist, but I see now that not being racist isn't enough. You have to be actively anti-racist." No one clapped, but someone nodded. That was enough. The police department, under federal oversight, began reviewing every traffic stop from the past 6 months. The data was stark. Black drivers were 3 times more likely to be pulled over in that district and twice as likely to be searched, even though they were less likely to be found with contraband. The chief held a press conference and admitted the disparity. "We were wrong," he said, "and we're committed to doing better." Critics called it performative, but others saw it as a start. She watched it all unfold from her office, not with satisfaction, but with cautious hope. Real change wasn't loud. It was slow. It happened in policy drafts, in training manuals, in quiet conversations between people who used to see each other as enemies. One afternoon, she received a thick envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter from Reeves. "Ma'am," it began, "I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know I've spent every day since that night trying to understand how I failed. Not just you, but my oath, my community, and myself. I believed I was being careful, but I was being cruel without even knowing it. I'm taking every training offered. I volunteered for the Community Outreach Unit. I know words aren't enough, but I'm trying to make my actions speak louder." She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, not to forget but to remember that people can change. Even when it's hard, the real test came a month later. A new bill was introduced in Congress, the Equitable Policing and National Security Act. It proposed tying federal law enforcement grants to departments that met standards in bias training, use of force reporting, and community engagement. It also created a national database to track traffic stops by race, gender, and outcome, so patterns like the one in her case could be spotted early. She testified again. This time the room was packed. Activists sat beside police chiefs. Students sat next to senators. And when she spoke, she didn't just talk about policy, she told stories. About the veteran stopped for looking suspicious near his own home. About the doctor pulled over while rushing to the hospital. About the teenager followed in a store for no reason. "These aren't isolated incidents," she said. "They're symptoms of a deeper problem. And we owe it to every American to fix it. Not because it's politically convenient, but because it's right." The bill passed the Senate with surprising bipartisan support. In the House, it faced more resistance, but momentum was building. Local departments across the country began adopting similar reforms on their own, fearing they'd lose funding if they didn't. She didn't take credit. She pointed to the activists, the researchers, the families who'd been speaking out for generations. "I just happened to be in a position where people finally listened," she told a small group of interns one day. But the truth was always there. Someone just had to be brave enough to say it out loud. At night, she still drove home alone sometimes. She still rolled down her window when lights flashed behind her. But now she carried something new, not fear, but purpose. Every time she passed that oak tree on the quiet street, she didn't look away. She looked straight at it. Because that spot wasn't just where she'd been humiliated. It was where she'd decided to fight, not for herself, but for everyone who'd ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And that, she knew, was the most important kind of security of all. 6 months later, the street looked the same. Same tall oaks, same quiet houses, same soft glow from porch lights as dusk settled over the neighborhood. But everything else had changed. She drove down it slowly, not because she was nervous, she wasn't, but because she wanted to see. To really see, the stop sign at the corner where she'd turned that night. The curb where she'd parked. The sidewalk where the officer had stood, hand near his belt, eyes full of suspicion. It was just a stretch of asphalt and concrete now, ordinary in every way, but it had become a landmark in her life, not of shame, but of turning. She didn't stop. She just kept driving, her hands relaxed on the wheel, her windows down to let in the cool evening air. A dog barked somewhere. A child laughed. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged in them. Back at her office, the changes were no longer just ideas. They were real. The federal guidelines she'd pushed for were now law. Every police department that received money from the Department of Justice for equipment Training or emergency response had to meet new standards. Mandatory de-escalation training, annual bias audits, public reporting of traffic stops broken down by race and outcome. Departments that failed to comply lost funding. Not all at once, but enough to get attention. It wasn't perfect. Some cities resisted. Some officers grumbled about political correctness, but others, many others, embraced it. They said the training made them better at their jobs. That understanding their own blind spots helped them build trust. That trust led to tips, to cooperation, to safer streets for everyone. One afternoon, she received a visit from a group of police chiefs from mid-sized cities across the country. They weren't there to argue. They were there to learn. We used to think this was just about avoiding lawsuits, one admitted. Now we see it's about effectiveness. When people trust us, they help us. She listened, nodded, and shared what she'd learned too. That national security wasn't just about drones and satellites. It was about sidewalks and street corners, about whether a mother felt safe letting her son walk to the store, about whether a scientist felt welcome driving through any neighborhood in the country. Real security, she told them, started with dignity. Meanwhile, the officer who'd stopped her, Reeves, had completed his reassignment. He wasn't patrolling anymore. He was working full-time in community outreach, organizing town halls between residents and police, mentoring new recruits on implicit bias, even volunteering at a youth center on weekends. He hadn't asked for his old job back. He said he'd found a better one. He never spoke publicly about that night. But in a quiet interview with a local news station, part of a series on police reform, he said something that went viral. I thought I was keeping people safe, but I was making some people feel less safe just by looking at them. That's not policing. That's prejudice wearing a badge, and I'm spending the rest of my career trying to make up for it. She saw the clip, didn't comment. But she saved it. Her own role had shifted too. She still briefed the president, still oversaw intelligence operations, but now equity was part of every conversation. When they discussed counterterrorism, they also talked about community trust. When they reviewed cybersecurity, they considered who had access to technology and who didn't. Security, she insisted, had to be whole. It couldn't protect borders while ignoring the people inside them. One day she got a call from a high school in Baltimore. A student there had started a club called Future Leaders in Public Service. They wanted to know if she'd speak to them just for 10 minutes over a secure video link. She cleared her schedule. When the call connected, a dozen faces appeared on screen. Young, eager, mostly black and brown, all watching her like she held the answers to their dreams. Why did you stay? One asked. After what happened, why didn't you quit? Why didn't you just walk away? She smiled softly. Because walking away would have meant letting that moment define me. And I refused to let someone else's ignorance decide my worth or my future. Another student raised a hand. Do you think things are really changing? She didn't give a polished answer. She told the truth. Change is slow. It's messy. Some days it feels like we're moving backward, but then I see a police department publish its stop data for the first time, or a young officer speak up when a colleague makes a biased comment, or a kid like you asking these questions, and I know we're moving forward. She paused. Real change doesn't happen in headlines. It happens in choices, in classrooms, in patrol cars, in living rooms, and it starts when people decide they won't accept the way things have always been. After the call, she sat quietly for a while. She thought about how far she'd come, not just in title, but in purpose. She'd once believed her job was to protect the country from outside threats. Now she knew it was also to protect it from the wounds it kept inflicting on itself. That evening, she attended a small ceremony at the Justice Department. They were unveiling a new training module for federal law enforcement, one she'd helped design. It wasn't just about rules, it was about stories, about empathy, about seeing the person before the profile. As she stood at the podium, she didn't talk about policy. She talked about humanity. We serve a nation of millions, she said, and every single one of them deserves to feel seen. Not as a threat, not as a statistic, but as a neighbor, a citizen, a human being. Afterward, an older officer approached her, gray hair, tired eyes, badge worn smooth from years of service. My grandson wants to be a cop, he said quietly. I used to worry he'd face danger out there. Now I worry he'll face the same blind spots I did. But seeing this, it gives me hope. She put a hand on his arm. Then help him see clearly, she said. That's the greatest gift you can give him and all of us. Months turned into a year. The news cycle moved on. New crises emerged. But the reforms held. Traffic stop disparities in that D.C. district dropped by 40%. Community trust surveys showed steady improvement. And more importantly, people started talking, not just about policing, but about belonging. She still drove herself home most nights. Still wore simple clothes. Still looked, to anyone who didn't know better, like just another professional heading home after a long day. And that was the point. One evening, as she turned onto her street, she saw a young woman walking her dog, a black woman in a business suit, briefcase in hand, laughing into her phone. She didn't flinch when a police cruiser passed slowly, didn't tense up, just kept walking, relaxed, at ease in her own skin, in her own neighborhood. She watched her in the rearview mirror until she turned the corner. That, more than any law or policy, was the victory. She pulled into her driveway, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment in the quiet. No sirens, no flashing lights, just the hum of the city settling into night. She thought about that night under the oak tree, the fear, the disbelief, the weight of the cuffs. It hadn't broken her. It had awakened her. And in doing so, it had sparked something bigger than herself. She got out of the car, locked it, and walked to her front door. The key turned smoothly. Inside, the house was warm, quiet, hers. She didn't look back at the street. She didn't need to, because now every time she drove past that intersection, she didn't remember the stop. She remembered why she leads.